Nintendo Direct season is rocketing towards us, and while the safe money is definitely on a September Direct of some sort, when in September are Nintendo likely to announce their new games? In this video, we're going to look at the base expectation and review some of my previous investigations into their Direct strategies. We're going to look at the history of September Directs, consider various factors, and look at the different major options and make some forecasts based on all of this. So first of all, let's consider the prior expectations that we have. I thought previously that Nintendo would go quiet prior to the price hike, which in most territories is in September. Obviously, they did have a May price hike in Japan, but for Europe and the Americas, the price hikes were to come into effect on the 1st of September. And so it would be logical to wait until after the 1st of September to do any major initiatives to juice sales. Now, I thought they might want to keep a bit of momentum up by having something smaller over the period, such as something Metroid focused, but for whatever reason that didn't happen. But clearly they are about to be ready to do something big for the Zelda 40th anniversary. And right back in January, I was saying that I thought they would probably wait for the September period to start the Zelda 40th rather than doing anything earlier, even though, of course, the anniversary itself was in February of 2026. But they have a movie coming up, and so it makes a lot of sense to initiate the 40th anniversary around September and have that period of the holiday season through to the movie release being one major period to focus on Zelda. And I think one of the previous expectations that I talked about is a tiers and tentpole strategy. So this is a video from earlier in the year, which I think still holds up, and I will link at the end. But to summarize it briefly, let's look at this table. So I suspect that Nintendo in recent years have been dividing up their advertising windows into what I am dubbing tiers and tentpoles. So the tier 1 started with a tease from Shuntaro Furukawa where he mentioned that there would be some news about the new Nintendo system in the financial year, but that in the meantime Nintendo will be focusing on having new announcements starting with a June Direct. So having teased that up, a few weeks later we got the June 2024 Direct. Following that up, there were further new announcements. So we got the several weeks during which they previewed and then finally announced Emio the Smiling Man. Then we had the big sales window during the holiday of 2024, and that climax pretty much with the last game of the first-party slate, that being Mario & Luigi Brothership. Obviously, there were smaller titles after that, but not ones that were first-party developed. And then we moved on to Tier 2. So in January 2025, we had a little tease of what the Switch 2 was doing, but we didn't get a full blowout until the March and April Directs of that year. Then they followed up with further announcements, so specifically the announcement of Splatoon Raiders that June, and then of course there was the Switch 2 launch itself, and that period kind of climaxed with Donkey Kong Bonanza in July, after which they went quite quiet. Then we had in September of 2025 the Mario Anniversary launch, which was pretty much concurrent with the September Direct, to be fair. They had the Animal Crossing Nintendo Switch 2 edition announced as a surprise drop in the January, and of course they had various other initiatives over that period, including the announcement of Star Fox, but I would still say their big focus was an extended period of time between holiday 2025 and the Mario movie, during which they wanted to sell a large number of games, and the climax to this very extended period was Splatoon Raiders in July, since when they've gone pretty quiet apart from obviously the Pocopia DLC. Now, my theory, I think, still applies when we look at the potential Tier 4. So we had the Zelda Ocarina of Time reveal in the June Direct, which fits in squarely with the category of the tease, of doing something a little bit in advance just to say, look, this is going to be the focus of where we're going next. I must admit I didn't expect there to be a tease of anything Zelda beforehand, but perhaps looking back at my prior video I should have done so. However, then we're expecting a showcase, and I think the September Direct will be that showcase. I do expect them to have something big to follow up. Now, if we are looking at another very long tier, a tier probably of about a year, then it would be likely for this to be either a February Direct or maybe some shadow drops during January. I don't necessarily think they're going to need a February Direct if they have a very strong September lineup, but it's still possible that they want to do something in the middle of this period to push things in the anticipation of the film. Then their major sales window will be a double hit. It will be both the holiday 2026 and the window of the Zelda movie, and I think the climax of this will be the July 2027 game, which I would expect to be fairly major. There are several significant periods where Nintendo likes to have chunky showcase games, and one of those periods is almost always the July game, because they don't often release a game in August, or at least if they do, it's either right at the end of the month or it's a very small digital title, and so it's good to have a pretty significant title to hold people over the Japanese holiday period particularly. Okay, so that's where I think Nintendo are going with their broad strategy. Let's have a look at September Direct specifically, and there is quite a rich history of September Direct. There have only been 2 years in the last 10 where there have not been a Direct in September. So we can see the date ranges here. On the 3rd of September back in 2020, we got the Super Mario Bros. 35th anniversary presentation, which is as close as I guess you can get to a Direct for that year, even though they didn't do a full Direct until 2021. Then you can see there are other years where there have been earlier presentations. So 2019 had a Direct on the 4th. There was going to be a 6th of September Direct, but the Hokkaido earthquake meant that it was pushed back a week. Now, that period of the 12th, 13th, 14th, that second week in September, is a popular one for Nintendo. Lots of years have had that week being the time that the September Direct launches, and there was the 2021 case of the 23rd of September, the third or arguably fourth week of the month being the one that is chosen. Generally speaking, though, I think we can expect Nintendo to go on the earlier side, or at least not much more than the middle of the month. But there are many factors that we need to consider when looking at when they will launch. These factors include the scheduling of the Tokyo Game Show, their own game release schedule, in this case Silver Week, which we'll discuss in a second, and of course there's the competition, specifically the Sony State of Play presentations, and there might be other one-off events. So we talked about the Hokkaido earthquake, but there might be floods and things which could push things into a different category, even if they originally planned for a different release date. So let's look at some of these. The Tokyo Game Show. The Tokyo Game Show is an annual event which is particularly significant for Nintendo in terms of showing their wares. Now, in 2019, it was unusually early, in 2020 it was digital, and in 2021 it was unusually late, and that's significant because in 2019 Nintendo's Direct was quite early, in 2020 they skipped a full Direct anyway, and in 2021 they also had a slightly later than usual Direct, and possibly part of that was pushing things a little bit later so that they could show them in the Tokyo Game Show to follow up the Direct launch. Now, in 2026, the Tokyo Game Show is scheduled for the 17th of September. The very latest that Nintendo has done a September Direct is on the launch day of the Tokyo Game Show. So while it's completely possible that they could do something after that, my suspicion is that this is the latest date that we would expect to see a September Direct revealed. Now, assuming that the presentation is Tuesday to Thursday, which is their normal case, very occasionally they've done a Friday presentation, very occasionally they've done a Monday presentation, but it's a bit tricky for them because, of course, with time zones, some of these things get pushed into the weekend in different parts of the world. So I think we can expect one of 9 dates to be the ones for the September Direct, either the 1st to 3rd of September, the 8th to the 10th of September, or the 15th to the 17th of September, those being the middle of the weeks of the 1st, 2nd and 3rd weeks of September. Complicating things further, therefore, are game releases, and of course this year we have quite a big game in the 3rd week of September, that being Fire Emblem's Fortune's Weave. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely that they will want to do anything to jeopardize their focus on Fortune's Weave, but of course, it's not necessarily clear that having a big Direct wouldn't benefit the game in terms of raising the salience of Nintendo and the Switch 2 at a time when they have a major title releasing. So giving this game a clear run would mean that they have no Direct until late September, but equally if they want to really fill the slate with major Nintendo announcements, get a lot of Nintendo hype building, well, in that case, they could definitely do something even up to the release of the game. I would have thought they would have left the 17th of September itself clear, given that that is not only the start date of the Tokyo Game Show, but also the release date of that major game. But then again, they did also release a Switch 2 trailer on top of the release of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD all the way back in 2025, so who knows. A further complication this year is the existence of Silver Week. Now, many people will know of the Japanese Golden Week in the spring, which is a period where there are a number of bank holidays consecutively, and it's a fairly big holiday period for Japanese people, including quite a good opportunity to sell lots of product, and Nintendo tend to set out the wares that will be significant to Golden Week a little bit earlier, very often right at the end of the financial year in March of the year. They will have a significant game, just like July. It's one of those big periods, and so that will tend to be the big Golden Week game that will push them through the next month or so. Now, it is less usual to have a Silver Week, but does happen as a result of certain quirks in the calendar. So Japan has holidays on the third Monday of September, the Respect the Aged Day, and it also has a holiday for the autumn equinox. But of course, that is decided by the moon, and so what sometimes happens is that you get 2 holidays in 3 working days. And when that happens, the day in the middle seems a bit pointless, and so the Japanese government declares what they call a citizen's holiday, and so you end up with 3 consecutive bank holidays. Now, this will be the first 3-day holiday since 2015, just as a quirk of the way the calendars have worked out, but it does mean that unusually there will be a fairly significant period where Nintendo can be selling games. And of course, they've got a pretty big game to sell in terms of Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. It's exactly the kind of game that will hold people over a significant holiday, so they don't need another game to announce in that period. But if they wanted to consider major promotional efforts, if they wanted to be coordinating things, it might be a little bit trickier to do that around the time of a bank holiday if some of their partners, let alone people within the company, are taking time off and so wouldn't be available. And so because of all these reasons, I think it is even more likely that they will go earlier rather than later to avoid the Silver Week rush, although of course they may want to have something in Silver Week itself because they think it's going to be a major sales push. Now, the state of play is another thing to consider. Sony often have presentations, and I've got here the number of dates this is ahead or behind of the Nintendo Direct September presentation compared to the State of Play show. So on the 24th of September in 2019, Sony had a presentation. This was 20 days after Nintendo. They went 13 days after in 2020, they went 14 days before in 2021, and then we got the rather unusual period in 2022 and 2023 where they decided to have both a Sony and a Nintendo presentation on the same day. And as far as I can tell, Sony announced afterwards, and so it seems to have been a Sony strategy to do this. After this, Nintendo, of course, didn't even have a 2024 presentation, and the 2025 presentation from Sony stuck to a later date, whereas Nintendo stuck with their usual early to middle of the month slot, and so there was no clash. Is it possible that we could see a clash again? Well, I'm not sure it's necessarily in either of the company's interests at this point for things to be so directly compared. I'm not sure that Sony is in rude health at the moment, so do they want necessarily to risk being eclipsed by Nintendo? Do Nintendo really want to be getting in the way of the Sony schedule? I really doubt that they would choose to put something on the same day. So my hunch is that if the presentations do line up back to back or even on the same day, it will likely just be a fluke of the many circumstances that affect the way that these things can be scheduled. By and large, it looks like Sony are fairly consistently targeting late September, and so my guess is that opens things up for Nintendo to go earlier. How early is the question. Now, personally, I think the likeliest option by far is a presentation next week, the 1st to the 3rd of September. And there are a number of reasons why I think they'll want to do this. First of all, if they have prices spiking on the 1st of September, what they don't want is this interruption where people who have already decided they're going to buy a Switch 2 have bought it, and now they just have machines that are sitting on the shelves, and the people who are going to buy in the holiday period have not yet started to pay attention, and so you just get this basically hangover period where there's just lots of dead stock. They're going to want to accelerate new sales as much as possible. Now, as well as this, they are going to want to build confidence with their retailers on what exactly is the plan to keep the systems moving, and so having a good bit of hype early in the month is going to be helpful. They may also want to introduce new models. We're pretty confident that there will be some kind of Zelda themed 40th anniversary machine, and so that will be something significant. And if they do have a big promotional blitz planned for Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, they may want to separate out the Fortune's Weave focus from the focus on anything else, and so doing it a little bit earlier in the month works out. So for example, when they had the Switch Lite and Link's Awakening released, they did a presentation relatively early in September. Now, they also want to be able to issue stock and then hopefully sell and clear those stocks before all of that retail space is going to be taken over by GTA, which is going to be in November. Clearly, Nintendo will still be able to sell quite a lot, and they've got quite a competitive set of games for the holiday season with Tomodachi and Zelda and Switch Sports Resort, but if they know that they're going to be competing so directly, they may decide that it's better to take the window earlier and really make a big push, and then hopefully sell most of the stuff they're going to sell before GTA kind of pushes them out. In previous years as well, not just in 2019, but also 2020, we have seen a week one presentation, but that may just be a fluke of the way things have worked out. Not just in 2019, but also in 2020, when there has been a game mid-September, they've tended to do a presentation earlier, but that may, of course, just be a bit of a fluke. Generally speaking, and not with perfect accuracy, but I have noted that they don't tend to put directs in the same week as big game reveals. They do often do them a little bit afterwards, and sometimes they'll do them a week or so before, but I suspect that when the company's focus is on pushing a major new release, it's just a little bit of a pain in the neck to try to have a major direct presentation as well, and they perhaps don't want to split their attention too badly. So I do think for lots and lots of reasons, the 1st to the 3rd of September makes an awful lot of sense. However, we can look at the next week, and I suspect the only reason we'll be likely to see an 8th or the 10th of September release is if they just think, well, look, it's a decent interval before Fortune's Weave and before the Tokyo Game Show. It's kind of a good middle point, and maybe there's some other reason internal to Nintendo, or perhaps something in the news that we can see which would cause them to say, actually, we want to go for the 8th, 9th, 10th, rather than going on the first week. They may also have other things that they want to consider. Now, having said that, if they do want to push it even later, then I think there is a case for the 15th to the 17th. The benefit of this would be that they can use those first 2 weeks of September to identify what I'm calling the default sales velocity of Switch 2 at its higher price point, which is to say, if they don't do anything else to gild the lily, if they don't do anything else to push sales, what is the actual velocity of Switch 2s being sold? And that is interesting to Nintendo because it's going to tell them how much they actually need to put their foot on the accelerator right now. How much do they actually need to show? If the data shows that in the first 2 weeks of September, they actually do have pretty resilient Switch 2 sales, what that suggests is that the machine is not particularly price sensitive at this point, and so adding on lots of big announcements for games which, while they may be big gains, possibly aren't yet ready to be fully shown, that might not be their best strategy. They might decide to keep their powder dry and save those announcements for a rainy day, which protects their developers and gives them much more options in terms of their strategy for releases for the future. However, if it shows that in the 1st of September, sales go completely off a cliff, well then they know they need to really juice things, and the best way to do that is to have some major announcements in September. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lag period between the data coming in, but they will be able to at least get a sense of the weather, and my hunch is that if they have lined up a whole raft of presentations for the September Direct, they could decide, well, do we add this one on or do we take this one off? I would guess that if there were to be a decision made on a big reveal, it would probably be something like the next 3D Mario game. They could decide, actually, I don't think we need that big Mario 3D game reveal right at the end, and so they could decide to take it off. And of course, the precedent for this would be in June of 2019. They did a surprise, even for many of the people working at Nintendo, and certainly for many of the journalists who saw the preview of the presentation, when they announced the sequel to Breath of the Wild right at the end of their regular presentation. This is the kind of time where, if they need to really juice sales, then obviously announcing a major 3D Mario would be great for them, but they could decide, under certain circumstances, that actually they don't need to push quite so much now. If they think, well, we don't know exactly when that game's going to be finished, we don't necessarily want to announce it a year or more ahead of time, and so they could decide to take a quick look at the early September sales figures to decide which way they're going to pivot, and then just cut that section of the presentation as required. Now, of course, doing something on the 15th to the 17th would also draw massive attention to Nintendo prior to the Fortune's Weave launch. If they do have a surprise announcement that they want to showcase in the Tokyo Game Show, that would be an ideal place to do it. And also, a subtle thing with this is that if they do a major Zelda push, which I think is almost certain, then what they'll be doing is associating Zelda with Fortune's Weave. And I've said for a long time that I think there is a very deliberate alignment between these two properties. Both are older skewing in terms of their focus audience, both have a swords and sorcery epic feel to them, and so you could easily imagine people who are interested in Zelda, of which there is a very significant number, particularly in the West, also looking at Fortune's Weave and going, actually, that looks like some nice Games of Thrones type action. I'm going to be interested. I'm going to pick it up, riding the hype wave of Zelda. So if you had a massive Zelda push on the 15th of September, and then Fortune's Weave was also massively focused and comes out on the 17th, that becomes the snap purchase for all those people who have an interest in Zelda, but suddenly are seeing something else that looks pretty cool, and that whim purchase therefore starts a new fan experience for people who are discovering Fire Emblem for the first time. I'm not necessarily saying this is the best strategy, but I can see a case to be made for why this could work. Now, another thing to consider is whether they would split a General Direct and a 40th anniversary. My sense is that there will almost certainly be a General, but we should consider different options. So, first of all, I think we know that there are more gaps than just Zelda the Plug. There is a 1st of October game already, which is the Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Nintendo Switch 2 edition, but very often Nintendo do release full titles on the same day as their Nintendo Switch 2 editions, especially if they're relatively small ones like Xenoblade Chronicles 2. My guess is that if you're shipping to stores for the 1st of October, you might as well send another game alongside it, potentially, and so I could see that being used as a release slot. Now, of course, it could be Ocarina of Time, but it could be something else besides, which they could announce in this holiday period. I still think it is very likely they will have something Mario this holiday, and so I think they're going to want to announce that pretty soon, and this again would push up the likelihood of a very early September release, because that's going to give a 4-week period before the 1st of October. Then we have the likelihood of a November game. It's not necessarily clear exactly how Nintendo are going to approach GTA, but they still usually do put something in November, and that remains on the table. It does seem likely to have a December game. Sometimes they do skip December, but generally speaking, they do have something in December, even if it's a slightly smaller title. They did put Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp there originally. They've had things like Fitness Boxing. Obviously, very occasionally, they've had to push major titles which just weren't quite ready for the October-November period. So Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, both are examples of games which did release in December. I don't necessarily think they view this as their major slot. I think they would prefer to have their bigger games release prior to the Thanksgiving, Black Friday period of sales in America particularly, but nevertheless, I could see there being a big December game if Nintendo feel that for whatever reason, November isn't going to be their optimum period to sell. I suspect Zelda will come before, but they might still have something significant as a place marker and a way to show that Switch 2 is still alive and kicking going into the new year. Then it is almost always the case that they announce January to March titles during the September Direct. Wouldn't be surprised to see something revealed for a little bit later on. Remember last year we got the announcement of Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, which was over a year away. So for example, a new Mario, something pretty big, could be a good show ender, giving a flavour of what is to come. They also really, at this point, need a bit of momentum, particularly after the price spike, and so I think a general direct is going to do a lot more than just a Zelda-focused direct. And actually, they've only missed 2 September generals in a decade, so 2020 and 2024, so it always has to be odds on. I guess the other option would be to have just a Zelda presentation on its own before September, and then maybe in the last week of September, perhaps even early October, do a general direct or something a little bit more. But I suspect that's unlikely, not least because, as I say, without a Mario game on the slate, it's feeling like a little bit of an underwhelming holiday season. Not necessarily the case that they need a Mario game, given that the momentum of the film and the large existing Mario library means that they will still be able to sell significant numbers of Mario titles. But all things considered, it's an unusual Nintendo holiday that doesn't have some kind of Mario representation. So in terms of forecasts, I think that 90% there will be a Nintendo Direct during the September window. I think probably, to me, a general direct by the 4th of September, that's the first week, is, probably the strongest individual likelihood. However, I could see a general direct in the week commencing the 14th of September as well. That, by implication, leaves a smaller but still decent chance of there being something in the second week. I can also see that Nintendo may just decide to, get their ducks in a row and then have things announced on the 8th of September. There may be other behind-the-scenes reasons why, for whatever reason, the 8th, 9th, 10th is the better slot for them, but this is where the probabilities are shaking out. Obviously, though, there may be things that I haven't considered, so please do sound off in the comments. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, please do consider checking out the Patreon or just liking and hyping and doing all that good stuff for the video to help it reach a new audience. Thank you as ever for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.